You are listening to Down Home. Welcome to Down Home, the Nova Scotian experience from two black men. I'm Derek Wise, and on behalf of Jay Jones, thank you for joining us. Former Poet Laureate for Nova Scotia, Belle Jones, joins the podcast this week to discuss the origins of her activism. The Mount St. Vincent professor continues to be an outspoken advocate for BIPOC communities in the province.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, yeah. On a high plateau from the one down.
Hey everybody, welcome to Down Home Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we have Belle Jones, who is an activist, poet, spoken word poet, also a professor. So hello, Elle Jones. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much. Well, during this podcast, we've been sort of looking to people from Nova Scotia or sort of who represent Nova Scotia and their Black history. And you were one of our people that crossed our minds. So thanks for joining us. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So at the age of 13, you read an Oscar Wilde book. And after I read this interview, and after you read the book, you said you were sort of overcome with this feeling to become a poet. Can you talk about what made you sort of express your thoughts and your words?
Yeah, well, actually, it's true about poetry in that story, but perhaps more importantly, what it did was introduce me to prison activism. So I actually read this when I was in Trinidad. It was the first time we were able to go back. It was my grandmother's 90th birthday. My mom is from Trinidad. She had to leave very early, obviously, to get an education. She wanted to take science, and there was no opportunities for girls on the island, so she had to leave at 15. And obviously wasn't able to afford to go back. Her father died, she couldn't go back. So I didn't go to Trinidad until I was 13 years old. And while we were there, obviously you're in the house, and I had always grown up seeing Oscar Wilde's book on the shelf, so it looked really adult to me, and I decided I was going to read this biography of him. And it had lines from Reading Jail in it, Ballad of Reading Jail, which is a poem about Oscar Wilde's incarceration. And I was at that age where your mind really opens up to issues. So I do think it very much had to do with being in Trinidad, to be honest. I think like experiencing my family, that homecoming, but then the mix of that where, you know, like you don't know your family because you're part of diaspora and you've been moved, and like, oh, you can't go outside because it's dangerous, you know, like those kind of narratives. I do think that contributed to perhaps a search for meaning I was having at that age. So yeah, I read the poem, and it just was the first issue, like an adult issue that I really understood that prisons are wrong. And that really, you know, and then that year we had to do an essay in social studies, and I did like women in prison, you know, everyone else did like photoshopping in magazines. I'm doing like, you know, the housing arrangements for women, how women should be able to parent their children. So it's something that, really formed my thinking about justice issues through art, and how you could be spoken to through art to understand issues and then bring those issues to other people. So I always say I became an abolitionist at age 13. And then that manifested itself later in my life through spoken word and poetry. So yeah, that's kind of the fuller version of that story. But yeah.
Oh, wow, cool. Now, you were born in Wales?
Yeah, so my mom, this is a diaspora story. My mom, like I said, she had to leave Trinidad. My aunt was living in London at the time. My oldest aunt was like the first Black woman to integrate the convent school in Trinidad. Like literally, you know, like... Wow. So, you know, she's quite a bit older than my mom. So she was at the time working in London, Paris. And so when my mom left, she was living with her, but she had to study alone. She had never had any, if you know anything about the British system, you have to take like O levels and A levels. So my mom had to do these exams by herself, like not in school, just studying the books by herself. And she was able to go to the University of Cardiff to study chemistry. And that's where she met my dad, who was Welsh. So.
And you grew up in Winnipeg. When did you move to Winnipeg?
Yeah, so we came to Canada when I was like 7, which is my 7th birthday. And then we were in Winnipeg, and then I came to Halifax University.
Okay. And that leads itself to another question. It seemed like when you moved to Nova Scotia, that really sort of sparked your activism. What was it about Nova Scotia that sort of made you really sort of follow that path? And
Black woman.
yeah,
The longer explanation is obviously I'm mixed race. Growing up, I mean, maybe there's more in Winnipeg now. There was like nothing for Black people in Winnipeg at the time.
Right.
Still, I know that when you go to like national Black things, people are from the prairies like, oh, there's nothing. So there definitely wasn't. We didn't have like Black History Month.
Right.
Like I said, I mean, I was very, I wasn't living with we weren't living with our family in Trinidad. So, it's like there wasn't a lot of Black connection. People often think I'm Indigenous. Like when I'm in Winnipeg, I get stopped for like being Indigenous. Like, I feel like a little dry. I be getting stopped with like cops. I didn't know why. And now I'm like, oh, they thought I was Native, right? Like, so there's much more Indigenous stuff in Winnipeg than Black stuff. So there just wasn't a lot. And then I came out here and it was Barb Hamilton Hinch. I was out here for school and I remember Barb Hamilton Hinch was the Black student advisor and like, Barb would like not even be wearing her shoes and like, came sprinting across campus to be like, you're Black, right? Like, or why aren't you coming up to the Black Student Advising Center, So it was really, I guess until that time I knew I was Black. Like I knew my family history. My mom's very, very strong on family history, but I hadn't, I suppose in some ways felt like I had a right, like as like mixed race people, you like, am I Black? Like as you're going through that period of time, like, will other Black people like me? So yeah, it was really Barb. And then Tinky was the next step. So Barb Hamilton was really like you're Black and you owe it to other Black students to help tutor and stuff and like just really allowed me to be myself in that sense and like go dirty with myself. And then the first political stuff I was doing was Tinky, Denise Allen, environmental racism in Lincolnville. And this is when I had started doing poetry. And I mentioned a poem. I can't remember. Anyway, I ended up with her knocking on doors in the square, handing out like flyers about environmental racism and how Africa was environmental racism. And that was like the first action I did. And with like people from Lincolnville and stuff. So yeah, in other words, Black woman happened. Like Black women, saw me and let me be myself and gave me myself and really, like did that thing that people do here where they're like, you're Black, right? So like what you do with Black people, why didn't I see you at this? Like, why aren't you coming out? And that was just really important for me. So yeah, I'll hail up African Nova Scotian Black women.
Indeed. Do you know if you have any sort of family, do you have any immediate family in Nova Scotia? I mean, Jones is I'm a Jones.
Well, that's the story is that there's 5 Jones brothers and 3 of them stay here and 2 of them go to Trinidad. So it seems like there's some historic connection. I don't know though. I mean, we're African diasporic people. Like who knows where we're from?
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true.
Yeah, and then I had a cousin actually that came out here that was the first Black principal of a school out here, the French school. I forget what it was called, Beaufait or something like that. So she, God, now I'm going to blank her name, Annie Edwards. So yeah, I had actually a cousin out here for years. Part of when I was coming out here, my mom, you know how your family is. Well, at least you have someone out there. So, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, there seems to be some historical ties, but I don't want to like bank on those. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
The records office burned down in Trinidad in like 1960. So the only thing anybody knows is like your family knows.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you've really sort of obviously made your home in Nova Scotia and you really have a sort of really feeling for its roots. Now, what role do you think poetry as an art form contributes to activism?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like not a person that thinks words are action. Like, despite being a writer, I think action is action. But I think poetry definitely. Tony Capeman Barra says the responsibility of an artist representing a marginalized community is to make revolution seem irresistible. And Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois said, "I don't give a damn for any art that is not also propaganda." Right. So that tradition that's come through the Black arts tradition of like art is politics. So. Like speaking to people in ways that they understand, like, people aren't going to attend, we have all these Zooms on abolition stuff. People aren't going to attend that. Like, you have to be at a certain, like, engagement of political and time and the privilege and, like the access, all of those things. So, people aren't necessarily going to come sit on a 3-hour Zoom where like academics discuss the principles of abolition. But if you're at a rally against street checks and it's in a poem, people understand that. Like Black people aren't stupid. Black people understand all the pieces of how to put everything together. Just sometimes like the word is being used differently, right? So when you said like, when you start saying defund the police, people are like, I don't know what that means. The minute you explain it, people are just like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like they spend all this money on like cameras in the parking lot. And then we can't get social assistance. You're like, exactly, right? So like Black people have all the pieces and all the understanding and all the knowledge. Like nobody needs to give that to anybody. but like poems can just help make those connections as you're listening, or listening to a piece of art or watching a film, and you're like, okay, I've always thought that. I hadn't necessarily said it that way. Now I can say it, or now I have the words, or now I've seen it in a different way, or express something I already know. So I think that's what art does, just bring that out of us.
It's true. And hip hop also over the years has always sort of been a platform for that. So that's pretty good. Yeah.
That's intellectual work, right? That like our art as Black people is always like not treated as art, so we were doing F for the Police in like 1990, right? Like not the conversation we're having now, like about police violence and like police commit violence, you can't catch them. Like, we were saying that stuff in hip hop, anti-state, anti-police, like the prison industrial complex, all that's been expressed through our music for generations.
Yeah, for generations, definitely. For sure. Yeah,
definitely. You mentioned defund the police. The Halifax Board of Police Commissioners, they appointed you to study that concept. What's been the outcome of that?
So we're just advertising the public hearings now. Obviously it meant that like we can't be in person, so it's been harder and harder to meet as a committee. But we have been meeting and doing the research. And the last piece is the public engagement sessions, which are supposed to be on June 19th. So people can sign up for that. There's also a survey that people can take. So we're actually just putting the final touches on just a quick website that people have. So all those materials are ready, they're vetted by the committee. And we're hoping that like average people will just like either fill out the survey or like answer a couple questions if you work for a nonprofit, or you can show up in person and do it at a hearing. So there's lots of ways, or take part in a focus group, which members of the committee are doing. So there's lots of ways for people to be part of that. And that's kind of the last stage, is that public engagement piece of getting to hear from community and what people think and what people want and what they imagine. So that's the stage we're at.
Oh, excellent.
Awesome. So what would you consider a successful outcome of that process?
Well, it's not oriented towards the government. I mean, they've refunded the police. I don't doubt they'll continue to do that, if we need more funding. It's for us. There's a lot of conversations, particularly for the Black community, that go on that take sort of ages to make their way down to us. Like, we're often left out of policy. Like, we weren't included in the conversation about legalizing cannabis, even though at that point about 50% of drug stops are actually being made on Black people. That's a really strong example, because every study shows that all races use and possess drugs at the exact same rate, right? So in fact, sometimes white people are slightly more, but it's either like white people slightly more or everybody equal. Yet Black people make up a huge amount of drug stops, which something also shown in the Wortley report. Yet Black people were not at the table. I don't really like the phrase, but we weren't really consulted at all, a part of the policy around like when cannabis was so-called legalized, which it wasn't legalized. They actually added more charges than ever. And like now there's like 48 charges you can get for cannabis, up from 3.
Yeah.
But, we didn't get amnesty, and we're just getting that now. We didn't get, any kind of reparation, like get to have dispensaries. They didn't reserve licenses for us to sell cannabis that could have repaid the community. There were a lot of Black people working in dispensaries that actually lost their jobs when we moved to provincial model. Like a lot of Black men that were actually part of that industry that then lost that opportunity to make money. So that was a huge failing in terms of how that should have responded to the criminalization of Black people. Provided us business opportunities. We should have been given preferential licenses to sell and grow marijuana, which could have allowed our communities to like actually thrive. And instead they basically concentrated in the government because we weren't there. So I think it's just important for us to like talk about these things. There's a push now on decriminalizing drugs, but Black people aren't talking about it. We are talking about it. We're just not talking about it like publicly. Unless it's like racial profiling, it's not considered an actual Black issue. So I just think that, we need to have that information. So I see this as more of an exercise for community, like not just our community, like the community as a whole, to start thinking about what it is we want, because then we'll pressure politicians. So it's not that I think tomorrow there's going to be a report and everyone's going to be like, oh, I read this report, let's defund the police. It doesn't work that way, but it gives us some information, some conversation, some basis to start. I'll be happy if we get cop-free mental health as a pilot. I think that's about the most we're going to get out of it, like as an immediate, probably something like, I think we can get cop-free mental health. I think we can get some push on stuff like that. Do I think they're going to defund the police? No, but I didn't think that starting it. I thought it was important. Like these reports are always white men. They're never Black people, even though the ideas come from us. And I thought it was important to have a Black woman doing this. Like we also, the Wortley report, the McDonald Taylor, like is never the name of a Black person on any of these reports, even though like it's our intellectual work and we've been the ones talking about this stuff. So I thought that was important. I thought it's important just to have something as a document for us to look at and say, oh, we could shift resources here. This is what we want to do. This is what people are saying. And then use that to organize our communities, because that change doesn't come from the government down. It has to come from the top up from us. So
yeah, for sure.
We as communities want something, like, then we have to push for it.
Yeah, it's tough that that reallocation of resources that have been allocated for policing for decades. It's tough to crack that nut, definitely.
Yeah,
and
just
all narratives about crime and punishment. I saw Cop Dog on Paw Patrol, so I think cops are good. I played with cop Legos, so I think cops. Like it's like and like my sister, her kid, when she got a alphabet book and it said like J is for justice, and there's like a picture of the RCMP. So you have to fight through a lot of social conditioning on these things, right? You just want murderers running the street. Well, what about rapists? Like those kind of questions. I'm not saying those are illegitimate questions. Like, what do we do with serious crime is a question. I'm not denying it. I just mean that, it's hard for people to necessarily see that conversation. And then I think in Canada, a lot of that conversation has only been happening like in universities.
Yeah.
So it's important that it makes its way down in whatever way to other people that just in community are talking about it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, just want to kind of switch gears a little bit. How do you inject Black Canadian content into your curriculum when you're kind of formulating your plans for the year when you're teaching? Yeah.
Well, for a certain extent, it will just be like natural. I mean, you almost end up always teaching like Robin Maynard, Policing Black Lives, if you're teaching anything on crime. I wouldn't say I go out of my way to do it. I would say it just happens because it's very often, the materials you're referring to. So depending on what I'm teaching, I was teaching gender and law this year. So obviously we studied like Black women, intersectionality, like, you have to start with Crenshaw there. We read pieces by Black women about like the prison industrial complex and women. Angela Davis is there, Miriam Kaba, Ruthie Gilmore, people in Canada, Christina Sharp, Dion Bratton. Like those are just important names anyway, people from here that, whether or not it's like a formal essay, like you have the words and work of someone like Lynn Jones or, Dolly Williams is working in like the care sector for a long time or whatever it is, right? So I just think when you have the knowledge of what Black people are doing, it's not hard to include it. So I wouldn't say that I even like go out of my way. It's just, it would just be there, because if I'm thinking about, who's critiquing like corporations and neoliberalism, I'm teaching corporate crime, like how Black people's reading of like corporations, slavery, and financial industry coming out of slavery is part of that critique, right? So when I get to the section on the historic corporate crime, it begins with slavery, right? So then you're going to be teaching Black people on that. So, I mean, I think it's just kind of part of Black studies really is, it's everywhere. We're typically ignored, but most concepts we've already thought through, and you really can't teach without it. So the real question is, why do white professors or mainstream professors find it so difficult to find and include Black content when Black content is generally indispensable for most of the topics like we're teaching, especially in like politics, criminology, sociology. I don't see how you would evade teaching content.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
interesting. It's just another side note. Actually, would like to get your opinion on some of the recent happenings in the States. There was that huge decision down in Minnesota, and then just as it was happening, Deandre Wright was killed. But what's your take on that, and the way that the Canadian media actually covers that as if it's kind of like a holier than thou, look at them down there kind of attitude? I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, just during the Derek Chauvin trial alone, there was like 64 killings of Black people in the 3 weeks that trial was taking place. So Chauvin is like the rare cop to be convicted, and then we don't know what the sentencing will be, but it looks like they will actually give him a sentence, as opposed to with Laquan McDonald, where that cop was convicted but got like 6 years and then with 1. So. But that's the system trying to preserve itself, right? So I understand it's hard because like Black people are like, can't you just let us be happy for like 1 minute, And, like that's true that, we need these minutes to pause and celebrate and feel something. But I think we also have to be realistic about why in that moment Chauvin was convicted. And I don't think it had to do with the system realizing that it was unjust. I think it had to do with staving off. They'd rather sacrifice Chauvin than deal with the consequences of what
the backlash.
So I think they basically were throwing us a bone, and then they argued that that would preserve the system. So I have this like long rant. It's probably too. Let me condense this rant. I've long had a rant about how every civil rights movie, like every movie about Black people, is set in a courtroom, right? Like Mississippi Burning, Amistad, To Kill a Mockingbird. And that's the reason, because the white system wants to say, sure, there's mistakes, but don't worry, you can still correct it through our white system. So if you go to court, it's the white lawyer that's going to stop lynchings, the white lawyer that's going to help you, right? And so that's that, sure, it's the bad apple argument. All we have to do is adjust things, right? So that's what they want to tell us, is that you can seek justice just through getting the right verdict and the right jury and just adjusting some things. And we're saying, no, we have to change the actual system, the relationship of capitalism, that Black people have been property in the system since the beginning of time. If we're not addressing the relationship between slavery, capitalism, and racism, which, is the whole root of what we're experiencing, a couple of Black jurors on a, European like system that's based in colonialism and patriarchy and racism isn't really going to help us, right? So I think that we have to be very clear-eyed around what is happening in this moment and how systems are trying to preserve themselves very badly from the mass movement of Black people. So they're trying to co-opt us. They're trying to water down what we're saying. They're trying to give us a little bit of money, sprinkle some government money among us, all in the hopes it will break solidarity. And some people will, okay, I got my job, so, I got what I need out of this. And we've seen that happening, like the critiques of Patrice Cullors and the Black Lives Matter Global Network, which are real critiques by the chapters and the victims' families about how, are you actually serving our community, or did you end up taking that money for yourself? And that isn't a discredit to the work of Black Lives Matter as like the average person who put on that t-shirt and came in the street. But that person and those people who lead that movement have ended up doing what we saw in South Africa, what we see all over the place, is people get into power and then they start taking the money and power for themselves, because we haven't changed what power looks like. And we as Black people need to say power can look differently. Do I need to have a huge mansion built off the backs of other Black people to be successful as a Black person, or is success when all of my people are housed? And that's what we're trying to shift, I think, as people, that we have to change how we think about our own positioning. So as far as the Canadian media goes, the Canadian media doesn't know what Black people say. Like, we were all on the news with Trudeau wearing blackface. Then we weren't on the news again until the summer, and then you're like, oh, here I am back on the news, what a shock, So, we remain only valuable voices when we have something to say that they think is about racism or race. They don't think that we have commentary on the daily economic flow of Canada or like the basic issues going on, right? You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, race in Canada is always, they only care when it happens in the States. And then they always act like what we're doing is somehow secondary to what's happening in the States, as though the States drives everything. And, one of the reasons why we don't have a Black Lives Matter chapter officially in Halifax isn't because we were late to the game. It's because we were early to the game. And people that were organizing at that time were like, why would we adopt something from the States when we had Buff here and we had Rocky here and we had all these movements? We don't need to adopt something from somewhere else. Like, we have our own history of political movement, and we don't need to legitimize it by something else, right? So, I think we always have to remember our own histories, like in this province. We're coming up, I think, this summer on 30 years of the Goddigan Street riots.
Oh, yes. Jay, do you remember? Oh, my goodness.
We lived right at the corner where it was happening.
Yeah.
They do an episode on that, right? Like, we don't talk about that as an early, like, anti-police movement, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And it was people starting challenging the dress codes at the bar, right? And people came out and they actually were so it was a big form of resistance taking place in the context of the Yonge Street battles in Toronto and Rodney King in LA. And this was Nova Scotia responding, Halifax responding. And we don't, talk that much about it, but it's an important moment, right? We don't even know our own histories of rebellion, right?
I know.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, this is a part of the reason why we're lending our voice to this, try and get it out.
Yeah, at least
you guys were like in the middle of that, right?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the biggest things we've learned just from doing these is just having the conversations about how you feel. And once you start to feel how you feel about something, then you can start to sort of talk about it. And then, if you can, Derek and I just have been having these amazing conversations, and it sort of made us want to lend our voice. And the biggest thing, like even Rocky Jones to mention his name, he said years ago that he always knew that blacks would be okay on an individual basis, but he worried about the black community. So it seems like we sort of have to get back that to find those strength in numbers where at least we can all sort of feel that collective energy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, especially now, because the big danger now is that as, BLM became popular, we also saw, all these institutions like universities, courts, whatever, being like, we stand with BLM. Like, weren't you being racist to me like yesterday? But we have to think about what that means. Like, what it means when a university is now suddenly saying, we want to hire black people, we want to give scholarships to black students. Like, black people didn't exist yesterday. So, like, what does that mean, right? And part of that is defocusing us, right? Convincing us that, like, as long as a couple more of us get to be a judge or, a university president, then there's no problem. Like, but people are living in housing and the rents going up as it's like privatized, obviously people are in prisons, people are in shelters, people can't pay their bills, people can't get their childcare, people are being investigated by child welfare. And until we're dealing with those issues, I don't know, the place to start is with the most privileged among us. And I count myself in that. I just got, tenured. So I'm not saying I'm not, what I mean? Like, but yeah, I mean, I wouldn't consider that to be some kind of victory for all black people. It helps me out. It means that I don't have to, live check to check anymore. But does that mean that therefore that matters to somebody living in housing when
exactly.
No, because we have to deal with that. We can't consider that. So I don't like the sort of, first grade or, the greatest or the list of the whatever, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's all of us that's important, as we say, like, all Black lives matter. Right. And so still all Black lives matter. None of our lives matter. So we're always as vulnerable as the least loved amongst us. Right. So I think that's just really important to keep remembering and keep pushing on.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this is great. Again, thank you very much for joining us. Do you have any parting words at all? Anything you want to put out there in the podcast first?
I mean, I remain very, Africa, Nova Scotia, and it's like a family. So, there's like back and forth and people don't always agree and people all, but as a place, it's one of those things where then when you go somewhere else, you like, oh man, like, at least in Nova Scotia we act, at least in Nova Scotia we this. So there's a lot of power here. People know who they are. People know their own history, the history of their name. People are rooted. People have community. And that's really powerful to say, I'm from here and it's my 8th generation back. And I don't know that we people know that, but I don't know if people realize how powerful that is. Like coming from a place like Winnipeg where there wasn't. So there's Black people in a community, but that's not the same as a Black community. Even when I go, like I've gone around the world now, and like there is something really powerful in this community that we really don't always value, because when you live in a place, you like think about its dysfunction and things that like get on your nerves, and I don't like this person, and this like that's human, right? But we have a really powerful history of organizing ourselves here, and we have really powerful elders that have survived and seen a lot. And being here, I would say, like, I owe everything in terms of my writing and in terms of my activism to this province. It wouldn't have happened anywhere else because of the particular history, the particular people like Rocky Jones who picked out young people and like literally molded you and encouraged you. Like I remember when I was doing poems at like Black History Month back in the day, and I'd be like talking about police and prisons and stuff, like, before it was cool, right? And everybody was getting like really mad at me, and Rocky would be there in the back just like pumping his fist and making me feel so good. And the older Black women who call me and continue to do so, either just to be like, good job on that thing you did, or like talk slower or whatever, but like, like that's really valuable. And I think for younger people, don't turn down that relationship to your elders and that history that we live among. It's so important to shape what we're doing. Lynn Jones every day reminds us, like whatever you're doing, she said, well, did you talk to community about that? Well, like, did you talk to community about that? Did you take that back to community? Just reminding us that, we live in a community and we owe each other other things. So I think that's really valuable and that's really important to me. And I'm not always living up to those values. And I make mistakes. I'm a human being like anybody else, activists don't talk enough about the mistakes we make and, how often we do things wrong and how often you're like, oh, why did I do that thing, but we just have to keep pushing forward. So together in community and like finding common ground and working together. And it's great that you're doing this podcast and getting that stuff out there too.
Awesome.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Are you still doing the CKDU?
Yeah, but COVID, you know what I mean? Like, so we just couldn't get it together. It's hard to like film it, you know, do the whole thing, cut it.
Mm-hmm.
Like we barely get it together. You know, we're like an hour before the show. We're like, "What's the news?" You know?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
you know how it is. So we're like, I
Yeah.
don't know if we can do that. And then the building was supposed to open, and then when we
Right.
were going back, it didn't open. So so we are still doing it. We've done
Yeah.
other projects through BPH. So what we're talking about is Black Power Hour on CKDU
Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
at normally when we're on the air Wednesdays at 9 p.m. We've done other initiatives. So we've done podcasts and we've done like actions. We were doing a film series last year. So we continue to do stuff through BPH.
Right.
It's not the show, but we're looking forward to doing it again.
Cool. And how long have you been doing that? It's been quite a while.
Yeah, BPH is like since 2015. And then we
Okay.
were on the radio before that. But
Right.
BPH specifically, and I got to shout out Randy Reilly here. Maybe he wants to come on your show. I don't know. So BPH is co-founded by Randy Reilly, who is wrongfully convicted. Please go to whoisrandyreilly.com to see Randy's story as he fights his wrongful conviction. He's currently out on bail, which is a huge step forward, as his conviction was vacated by the Supreme Court. It's a really awful case that many people, of course, will recognize the daily injustices of the justice system towards African Nova Scotians. Randy was accused and convicted of killing a white man. No forensics evidence. Somebody else confessed to the crime. Literally no witnesses, nothing, like literally nothing. The main witness has now recanted his testimony and said that the police coerced him. They paid him, which didn't come up in court, which the Crown knew he had been paid. The cop lied on the stand, like all kinds of misconduct, evidence that went missing. And, you know, he ended up convicted and has spent most of his 20s in prison. So we've been fighting that case for a long time. And we continue to fight it. And Randy continues that struggle. So, you know, an African Nova Scotian man from Cherrybrook, who the first thing he did when he got out was look for jobs for people in his community. You know, who has led Black men during the time he was incarcerated. Really powerful person. And yeah, so that, and he's one of the co-founders of our radio show. So check out whoisrandyreilly.com. Many people are like vibing without wearing the shirts and stuff, and continuing to fight for him.
Jay Jones, we're gonna reach out to Randy, man.
For sure, man. Let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah, my family's actually from Cherrybrook, so
I
might be able to.
You know, Betty Drummond. Like,
I haven't been home in a long time. I moved away. I moved away in '96. So
it's been
like farming the land right now on Bay, you know, so which is really important, you know, and like a brilliant young African Nova Scotian man who's faced a huge injustice and is still fighting, and I find him really inspiring. So
that's great. Yeah, we need to see more people like that. You know, it's like I said, us doing this podcast and looking back at our Nova Scotian roots, it's just been so inspiring, and just to know that resilience of strength that we do have and where it really came from. And sometimes, like you say, you know, you get caught up in your own life and you forget about those things. But now more than ever.
I gotta ask, where's your Jones from?
Originally from Truro, Nova Scotia.
Okay,
My family was my family was one of the first Black families to settle in Truro. And then my great grandfather, I was raised by Sidney Morgan Jones. He was a member of the first Black battalion that fought in the First World War and had strong ties to Cornwallis Street Baptist Church. And Rocky is my uncle. You know, so and I'm starting to sort of look at that part of my life that I kind of just forgot, you know, and that was my own journey. But to look back and know that I have that strength to pull from makes it easier to sort of navigate this life a little bit. And I'd forgotten that, you know.
The Jones is serious business, man.
Yeah. Well, when I was researching my family history, I ran across Jones in the Book of Negroes more than once, man. So
the first settler of Africa. No, that's Brown. Sorry. But there's Jones and I don't know if you know the story of Jeremiah Jones potentially having been murdered for fighting the road coming and stuff. Like, it's powerful blood, you know. As all of Nova Scotia, I think the important thing about African Nova Scotians is that every single person here is the descendant of a self-liberated Black person. Which is powerful, right? Like, people either freed themselves as refugees of the War of 1812, came up as loyalists. You know, like, people here are people who freed themselves. And that spirit is like through Africville, through North Preston, through the founding and making of communities, holding those communities down, keeping an identity, like all of that. Richard Pressman walking literally, 17 times across his province to found the AUBA. Like, the Panthers coming here, like the resistance in the 60s. Like, there's just a really long and powerful history and spirit here. So, we don't necessarily know enough about it,
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jay Jones, you want to take us out? You kind of did already, but.
Yeah, I guess we just did. But thank you so much for coming on and speaking with passion and sharing a little bit of your story and some stories that we don't even know. You've made Nova Scotia your home, and you're really a true inspiration. So thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
You have been listening to Down Home. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Breaking new ground, 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 yeah. On a high plateau, from the one down below to the
song Breaking New Ground from The Breakdown.
With the force from the soul, reaching all aspects, getting deep, no time to sleep as you reach your next phase, laying it all on the line. New trails start to blaze, it's a fire inside, a brand new path, breaking down the sum to one, feeling free, I just laugh.